Claire Adams spent $83 on 12 dusty mason jars full of dead-looking seed while an entire auction barn in Harper County laughed at her. One man barked like a chicken. Another shouted, "Hell, Claire's buying bird feed now." Even Grant Holloway leaned against a steel gate, smiling like the whole thing was entertainment. And Claire, 68 years old, widowed, standing there in a faded work shirt with dirt still on her boots, never said a word. Now let me tell you something. 3 dry months later, half that county would be standing at Claire Adams' fence begging to buy those jars back. If you've ever watched people laugh at someone too early, stay with me. Let me tell you about Harper County, Kansas. If you drove through it too fast, you'd think it was just another stretch of dry American farmland trying to survive another uncertain year. Grain elevators, windbreak trees bent sideways from decades of prairie wind. Pickup trucks covered in dust so thick you could write your name on the doors. But people who live long enough in places like Harper County understand something outsiders never do. A town can smile at you every Sunday morning and still quietly decide your life is already over. That was Claire Adams. By the spring of 2008, most people in Harper County had already placed her in the category reserved for old farms and old widows, the kind folks speak about gently, because they assume decline is inevitable. She's hanging on. That was the phrase people used. Not farming, not building, not planning, just hanging on. Claire Adams was 68 years old and lived alone on a 140-acre dryland farm about 7 miles west of town. The farmhouse sat low against the Kansas wind, white paint peeling off the siding in long curls. The barn leaned slightly east after surviving 40 winters more than it probably should have. And every morning before sunrise, Claire still walked the property herself. Not because she had to, because Walter used to. Now let me pause here. You learn a lot about love by watching what people continue doing after death removes the audience. Walter Adams had been dead for 6 years. Heart attack. Collapsed beside a grain auger on an October afternoon while unloading sorghum. Folks said he died quick, which is the kind of thing people say when they don't know what else to offer a widow standing in church clothes beside a coffin. After the funeral, casseroles came for about 2 weeks. Phone calls for maybe 2 months. By winter, most people returned to their own lives. But Claire kept farming. That surprised people. Not because she lacked intelligence. Because Harper County had quietly decided modern farming belonged to younger men with larger loans, newer machinery, GPS planting systems, and seed contracts thick as telephone books. Claire had none of that. Her combine was older than some marriages in town. Her pickup rattled at stop signs. And she still stored seed in mason jars. That last detail especially amused people. You have to understand the culture out there. By 2008, seed companies had convinced half the Midwest that farming wisdom came in glossy brochures and dealer meetings held inside hotel conference rooms with free coffee and branded pens. Every season promised bigger yields, bigger resistance, bigger profits, everything bigger except the debt. Grant Holloway understood that better than anyone. Grant owned Holloway Ag Supply, the largest seed and chemical dealership in Harper County. 43 years old, pressed jeans, white pickup truck washed every morning, whether it needed it or not. Men like Grant spoke about farming the way stockbrokers talk about markets. Efficiency, optimization, scale. And to be fair, Grant was successful, very successful. His customers planted thousands of acres. His dealership sponsored Little League teams, church fundraisers, and the county fair livestock auction. But success has a dangerous side effect. After enough winning, some people begin mistaking profitability for wisdom. Grant used to smile whenever Claire Adams walked into town. Not a cruel smile exactly. Worse, a patient one. The kind people use when they think they've outgrown you. Well, he'd say leaning back in his chair at the coffee diner, "Claire's still farming like it's 1978. The men around him usually laughed. Not hard, just enough. And Claire always ignored it. That bothered them more. Because mockery loses power when the target refuses to perform humiliation for the crowd. Every Thursday morning, Claire came into town for feed hardware supplies and coffee at Miller's Diner. Same booth, same order. Black coffee and toast. Sheriff Dale Mercer usually sat 2 booths over. Dale was one of the few men in Harper County who never laughed at Claire Adams. Partly because he was old enough to remember Walter. Partly because he'd seen enough life to understand quiet people were often carrying heavier loads than loud ones. One morning, after hearing a younger farmer joke that Claire's farm would probably be sold within the year, Dale finally looked up from his coffee. "You boys ever notice," he said calmly, "how people who survive hard times usually talk the least about themselves. The diner went quiet for a second, not because anyone felt ashamed, because rural towns operate on invisible hierarchies and Dale Mercer still carried weight. Claire simply thanked the waitress, paid her bill, and left. That was her way. No speeches, no self-defense, no bitterness on display. But inside the farmhouse, things were different. At night, Claire kept Walter's notebook stacked beside the kitchen table. Rainfall records, soil conditions, planting notes, yield observations stretching back almost 27 years, every page written in careful pencil. Walter believed memory mattered. Modern agriculture had started treating land like a machine. Walter never did. To him, land was more like a stubborn old friend. It remembered how you treated it. Claire believed that too. Sometimes after dinner, she would sit alone beneath the yellow kitchen light and reread entries from drought years. Walter had underlined one sentence twice in an old notebook. Bad years reveal what seed was built for. Sit with that for a moment, because nearly everybody in Harper County was preparing for another high-yield season. Commodity prices looked decent. Winter moisture had been disappointing, but not alarming yet. Most farmers still trusted irrigation forecasts and spring projections. But Claire noticed things others ignored. The ponds were lower earlier than usual. The subsoil felt wrong beneath her boots. Wind carried a dryness in March that normally arrived in late May. And perhaps most important of all, the old farmers were nervous. Not the young ones. The old ones. Men who checked fence lines twice. Men who studied clouds without speaking. Men who remembered stories their fathers told about years when the sky simply stopped giving back. One afternoon, Leah Turner came by the farm. Leah taught 8th grade science at Harper County Middle School and rented a small house near town. 29 years old, curious, sharp-minded, one of the few younger people who genuinely listened when Claire spoke. She found Claire repairing an old grain screen behind the barn. "You still doing all this yourself?" Leah asked. Claire smiled faintly. "Well, the machinery hasn't volunteered." Leah laughed. Then her expression softened. "You ever think about selling—" There it was. The question everyone eventually asked. Claire kept tightening a bolt before answering. "Walter built this place 1 acre at a time," she said quietly. "You don't abandon something that spent 40 years feeding you." Leah nodded slowly. And right there, without realizing it, she understood something the rest of Harper County did not. Claire Adams wasn't farming because she refused to move on. She was farming because she remembered. There's a difference, a massive one. And before that year ended, Harper County would learn it the hard way. The estate auction for Elias Bennett happened on a windy Tuesday morning in late March. And if you've never attended a rural estate auction in Kansas, let me explain something to you. People don't just come to buy things. They come to measure what a dead man's life was worth. That's the ugly truth nobody says out loud. Pickup trucks lined both sides of the gravel road leading to the Bennett property. Farmers stood in groups drinking burnt coffee from foam cups, while the auction crew tagged machinery with orange stickers. Old plows, rusting fuel tanks, bent irrigation pipe, half-working welders. 40 years of labor reduced to numbered lots and clipboard notes. The Bennett farm sat on the edge of Harper County where the land turned flatter and meaner. Dry country, hard country. The kind of ground that punished careless farmers quickly. Elias Bennett had farmed there alone nearly 20 years after his wife died. No children, no grandchildren, just land and weather. When he passed during the winter, most people assumed the auction would be unremarkable. And for the first hour, it was. Men circled tractors with the cold professionalism of gamblers studying cards. Buyers argued over engine hours and tire wear. Grant Holloway moved confidently through the crowd, shaking hands and joking loud enough for people to notice. Grant enjoyed auctions. Not because he needed equipment, because auctions reminded him who was winning. Now let me pause here. Success becomes dangerous when a man starts believing survival itself proves moral superiority. Grant Holloway had crossed that line years earlier. Around 10:30, Claire Adams arrived. Her old Ford pickup rattled onto the property, trailing dust behind it. She parked near a collapsed fence and climbed out wearing a faded blue plaid work shirt beneath a canvas jacket Walter used to wear during cold planting mornings. Some people nodded politely. Others barely noticed. A few exchanged quiet looks. There goes Claire Adams, still hanging on. Sheriff Dale Mercer spotted her from near the equipment shed and walked over slowly. "You came for machinery?" he asked. Claire shook her head. "Just looking." Dale smiled slightly. Dangerous thing at an auction. Claire gave the faintest hint of a grin. Depends what people overlook. Dale chuckled at that, though neither of them knew yet how true the statement really was. The wind picked up harder around noon. Auctioneers have a rhythm to them. Fast voices. Sharp eyes. They move crowds forward before people think too carefully about money. Lot 43, who'll give me 200, now 3, 3. 3, sold. Metal clanged. Engines coughed. Men argued numbers. And then almost accidentally Claire saw the wooden crate. It sat half-hidden beside a broken feed cabinet near the barn wall. Dust-covered mason jars. 12 of them, every lid sealed in old wax. Handwritten labels faded almost white with age. Most people walked right past. Why wouldn't they? To modern farmers, old seed looked like old rope, something sentimental people forgot to throw away. But Claire stopped walking, and something in her face changed. Not excitement, recognition. She crouched slowly beside the crate and brushed dirt from one label. Red Plains 43. Another jar read, Dry Creek White Milo. Another Bennett line, C. Claire stared at the handwriting a long moment. Then she noticed something else. A weathered notebook shoved beneath the jars. She slid it partially free. Rainfall records, planting observations, dates going back decades. The handwriting belonged to Elias Bennett. Claire's heartbeat slowed. That's what happens when experienced people encounter something valuable. They don't get louder. They get quieter. Grant Holloway noticed her crouched there and wandered over with casual amusement. Well now, he said. What'd you find, Claire Antiques? Several nearby farmers laughed. Claire ignored him and kept reading the labels. Grant bent slightly and picked up one jar. Lord, he said loudly, these things probably predate Reagan. More laughter. One younger farmer named Travis Cole grinned and said, Might still plant better than my first marriage. That got a bigger reaction. Claire finally stood. You selling these? She asked the auction worker nearby. The man shrugged. Wasn't even sure they'd go up. Figured they were decoration. Grant smirked. You planning to start a museum? Claire met his eyes calmly. No, she said. I'm planning to buy them. And there it was, the moment the crowd decided entertainment had arrived. By the time the jars came up for bidding nearly 20 minutes later, word had spread across the auction yard. People gathered mostly to watch Claire embarrass herself. The auctioneer held up one dusty jar uncertainly. Well, he laughed. Looks like we got old seed here, whole crate included. Scattered chuckles moved through the crowd. Who'll give me $20? Claire lifted her hand immediately. 20. A few men grinned. Grant folded his arms. Amazing, he said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Claire's buying bird feed now. The crowd laughed harder. But Claire never looked away from the auctioneer. 30, the auctioneer asked. Grant raised 2 fingers casually. 30. Now understand this clearly. Grant did not want the seed. Men like Grant never waste energy on worthless things. No, he wanted the audience. Claire answered instantly. 40. Grant smiled wider. 50. People began turning fully toward the exchange now. Even men near the machinery stopped listening to other bids. Claire's expression never changed. 60. Grant tilted his head. You know those seeds are probably dead, right? Claire said nothing. 70, Grant announced. The crowd waited. Wind rattled loose tin on the barn roof. Claire looked once toward the jars, then toward the notebook beneath them. $83, she said calmly. A strange number, precise, final. The auctioneer blinked. Grant laughed softly. You can have 'em. Sold. And just like that, decades of forgotten seed became Claire Adams' property. Now let me tell you the part people remembered afterward. Not the sale itself. The humiliation. As Claire loaded the crate into the back of her truck, several younger men standing near the fuel tanks began making clucking noises like chickens scratching grain. One yelled, Don't plant too deep. Claire might wake up the dinosaurs. Another shouted, Careful! Those seeds qualify for Social Security. Even some older farmers laughed, not cruelly maybe, but carelessly. And carelessness can wound just as deeply. Claire kept loading the jars one at a time. Gentle, almost respectful. Grant walked past on his way toward his truck and stopped beside her briefly. You know, he said, lowering his voice slightly, people romanticize old farming too much. Claire kept her eyes on the crate. Grant continued. There's a reason modern seed replaced this stuff. Finally, Claire looked at him, and there was something unsettling about how calm she appeared. You might be right, she said quietly. Grant nodded once, like a man concluding a conversation he'd already won. Then he walked away. But after everyone left, after the dust settled, after the Bennett property grew quiet again beneath the endless Kansas sky, Claire sat alone in her truck without starting the engine. She pulled the old notebook onto her lap. The first page crackled softly when she opened it. Rainfall log 1981. Below it were handwritten notes. Dry June. Hot wind. Line C survived Westfield best. Claire turned another page. Then another. Year after year. Drought observations. Root notes. Yield survival percentages. Not maximum production. Survival. And suddenly Claire understood exactly what Elias Bennett had spent 30 years doing in silence while the rest of the county chased bigger yields. He had been breeding seed for hard years. Not good ones. Sit with that for a moment. Because outside the truck windows, Harper County still believed Claire Adams had just wasted $83 on dead seed in dusty jars. And 3 months later, nearly every one of them would wish they had been standing where she was. For the next 2 weeks, Claire Adams barely spoke to anyone. That wasn't unusual. But there's a difference between a person being quiet and a person thinking deeply enough to disappear inside their own mind. Every morning before sunrise, Claire carried the mason jars from the truck into Walter's old workshop one at a time. The building smelled like machine oil dust and old cedar shelves. Walter had built the place himself back in 1983, and almost nothing inside had changed since his death. His gloves still hung beside the workbench, his seed screen still leaned against the wall, and his notebooks remained stacked exactly where he left them. Claire cleared a section of the bench carefully and lined up the jars beneath the hanging light. Red Plains 43. Bennett, line C. Dry Creek White Milo. The labels looked almost ghost-like under the yellow bulb. Now let me tell you something important. Most people think farming begins in the field. The old farmers knew better. Farming begins with observation. Claire unscrewed the first lid slowly. The scent surprised her immediately. Earthy, dry, still alive. She poured several seeds into her palm and studied them in silence. Smaller than modern hybrids, less uniform too. Different shades mixed together slightly. Modern seed companies hated inconsistency, but old survival farmers distrusted perfection. That difference matters more than most people understand. Claire filled shallow trays with damp paper towels and placed samples from each jar into careful rows. Then she wrote dates and labels in a notebook of her own. Leah Turner arrived the following afternoon carrying coffee and curiosity. You look like a scientist in here, she joked gently. Claire smiled faintly without looking up. No, she said. Scientists usually get funding. Leah laughed. Then she noticed the trays. Are those actually sprouting? Tiny white roots had already begun pushing through several cracked seeds. Claire nodded once. Better than I expected. Leah stepped closer. I thought everyone said old seed dies. Claire finally looked at her. Most people don't understand the difference between dead seed and neglected seed. Sit with that for a moment, because the sentence wasn't really about farming. Claire spent the next several days studying Elias Bennett's notebook line by line. Rainfall measurements, root observations, heat notes, field locations. One page stopped her cold. 1988, severe drought. Hybrid field failed by July. Line C held green until August. Claire leaned back slowly in Walter's old chair. The drought year. Every farmer in Kansas remembered 1988. People still talked about it the way soldiers talk about war. Wells dried up, pastures turned gray, cornfields curled into brittle paper. Some farms never recovered financially. And somehow, Elias Bennett had spent decades quietly selecting seed from plants that survived years exactly like that. Not highest yield, not prettiest stalks. Survival. Walter would have understood immediately. In fact, maybe he already had. That thought settled heavily over Claire one evening while she searched through Walter's notebooks. Near the bottom of a stack, she found an old page folded into thirds. A handwritten note. Bennett still selecting for drought tolerance. Most folks think he's stubborn. I think he's preparing for something. No date, no explanation. Claire stared at the sentence a very long time, then she closed her eyes. And for the first time in months, grief hit her hard enough to bend her forward slightly in the chair. Not dramatic grief, Not movie grief, the real kind. The quiet kind widows carry alone in kitchens after dark. Walter would have loved this. That's what hurt. Now let me pause here. One of the cruelest things about losing someone is realizing how many future conversations disappear with them. Outside spring winds rattled the workshop walls. Claire wiped her eyes once and returned to work. Because that's another thing older generations understood better than ours. Pain did not excuse abandoning responsibility. A week later, Claire drove into town for supplies. Grant Holloway was inside Miller's Feed and Seed talking loudly near the counter when she walked in. Hybrid drought package is moving fast this year, he told a customer confidently. New genetics are 20% more efficient under heat stress. Claire continued toward the fertilizer aisle without speaking. Grant noticed her anyway. Well, now he called out casually, "How are those museum seeds doing?" Several customers grinned. Claire picked up a bag of mineral supplement before answering. "They're alive." Grant smirked. "So are weeds." The men around him chuckled. Claire never reacted, and that irritated Grant more than open argument would have. People like Grant depend on visible surrender. Without it, mockery feels incomplete. As Claire checked out, old Pastor Raymond Pike entered the store carrying fencing staples. Raymond watched Grant's table quietly for a moment before turning toward Claire. "You planting this year?" he asked. Claire nodded. "Some." Grant laughed softly behind them. "Well, hopefully not with those auction relics." Pastor Pike looked at Grant calmly. "You know, he said Noah probably sounded crazy too right before it rained." The store went silent. Grant forced a smile. "Bit dramatic, Pastor." Maybe Raymond replied gently. But history's full of people who mistook confidence for wisdom. Claire left without adding a word. That evening she walked the western edge of her property carrying a soil probe and notebook. The land there sat slightly higher, rougher, less productive in wet years, which made it exactly right for the test. 18 acres. That was all she decided to risk. Not because she lacked courage, because experienced farmers never gamble emotionally. Claire planted slowly over 3 long days. The old drill rattled behind her tractor beneath pale Kansas skies while dust drifted across the field in thin sheets. No fancy treatment packages. No high-density population strategy, just careful spacing, careful depth, careful faith. And every evening afterward, Claire walked those rows alone, watching, waiting, remembering. One afternoon, Leah asked the question nobody else dared ask directly. "What if they're wrong?" Claire looked across the field quietly. "The seeds." Leah nodded. Claire took longer answering than expected. "Then I lose 18 acres. And if they're right," Claire's eyes stayed on the horizon. "Then the county forgot something important." Leah frowned slightly. What Claire bent down and picked up a handful of dry soil. That survival and abundance aren't the same thing. The wind carried dust between them. Far off across the county, newer fields were already turning bright green beneath aggressive fertilizer programs and expensive hybrid genetics. Those fields looked impressive. Uniform, perfect, modern. Claire's field barely looked planted yet, and Harper County noticed. Within days, the gossip spread again. Claire Adams planted Old Bennett seed. People laughed harder this time because now there was visible proof. She wasn't just eccentric. She was risking an actual crop. At Miller's Diner, Grant Holloway used the story openly during coffee conversations. "This is exactly why small farms disappear," he told a table full of younger farmers one morning. "Emotion replaces economics." Heads nodded. Someone asked if Claire was going broke. Grant shrugged dramatically. "Hard to save people from themselves. Sheriff Dale Mercer happened to overhear that one." He stirred his coffee once before speaking. "You know the funny thing about droughts," Dale said calmly. Grant looked over. "What's that?" The loudest experts usually run out of answers first. The table quieted. Grant smiled politely but said nothing more. And meanwhile, out west of town, beneath endless Kansas skies, tiny roots from forgotten seed were already pushing deeper into dry earth than anyone yet realized. By the second week of May, Harper County looked exactly the way successful farming magazines like to photograph it. Long green rows stretched beneath wide Kansas skies. Sprayers moved across fields like mechanical insects. Young corn stood tall and confident, and nearly everybody felt reassured. That's the dangerous thing about early growth. It makes people believe the season has already decided to be kind. Claire Adams knew better. Every morning before sunrise, she drove the western 18 acres in Walter's old tractor while cold wind carried dust low across the ground. From a distance, her field looked disappointing. Sparse stands, uneven spacing, plants shorter than neighboring fields by several inches. The kind of field modern farmers dismissed immediately. And Harper County absolutely noticed. One afternoon, 2 pickup trucks slowed beside Claire's roadside fence while she checked emergence along the rows. Nolan Briggs leaned out his window, grinning. Nolan farmed nearly 4,000 acres and loved the sound of his own certainty. Well, he called out looks like those antique seeds forgot what century this is. The younger man beside him laughed loudly. Claire stood slowly brushing dirt from her gloves. Maybe she said calmly. Nolan pointed toward his own fields, visible half a mile away. You ought to come look at real genetics sometime. Claire glanced toward the horizon. Healthy crops don't prove much in May. Nolan smirked. Neither do dying ones. The trucks drove off trailing dust. Claire returned to her rows without another word. Now let me pause here. There's a particular cruelty in rural communities that outsiders rarely understand. People don't just want to succeed. They want visible proof that someone else's way failed. Because if another path works too, then maybe all their certainty wasn't certainty after all. That possibility unsettles people, especially proud people. At Miller's Diner, Grant Holloway had quietly turned Claire Adams into a local cautionary tale. Emotion farming, he called it. Every few mornings, he'd stand near the coffee counter holding court like a preacher of modern agriculture. You can't run farms on nostalgia, he told younger farmers. This isn't 1952 anymore. Heads nodded around him. And to be fair, Grant's fields looked beautiful. Uniform emergence, strong early vigor, dark green color from aggressive fertility programs, exactly the kind of crop that wins admiration in spring. Meanwhile, Claire's western field looked weak enough that some people openly wondered whether she'd even harvest it. Even Leah Turner struggled at first. One evening, she walked the rows beside Claire beneath a pale orange sunset. I'm trying to trust you, Leah admitted carefully, but these plants really do look rough. Claire knelt beside one struggling stalk. Pull one up. Leah hesitated. You sure? Claire nodded. Leah grasped the base gently and tugged. The root resisted. Her expression changed slightly. She pulled harder. When the plant finally came free, dirt clung deep along a surprisingly long root system. Leah blinked. That's deeper than it should be already. Claire nodded once. 3 inches deeper than Grant's hybrid roots last week. Leah looked stunned. How do you know that? Claire smiled faintly. Because I checked. Sit with that for a moment, because most people only study what's visible above ground. Old farmers learn to pay attention to what survives underground. Claire walked farther down the row and dug carefully with a narrow spade. The soil beneath her field still held traces of cool moisture deeper below the surface. Not much, but enough. The neighboring fields looked prettier because they were spending water faster. Claire's field looked weaker because the plants were investing downward instead of upward. Different priorities, different survival strategy. And nature always reveals which strategy matters more eventually. 3 days later, Harper County passed 27 consecutive days without measurable rain. That began changing people, not publicly yet, privately. Men started studying weather apps more often. Coffee shop conversations became quieter. Wind carried a strange, brittle heat even before summer officially arrived. Sheriff Dale Mercer noticed it first in town. Farmers stopped lingering after breakfast. They ate faster, talked less. Drought anxiety moves through rural communities like smoke, invisible at first, then suddenly everywhere. One afternoon, Dale drove out to Claire's property under the excuse of checking a fence complaint nearby. He found her sitting on the tailgate of her truck writing notes. You keeping rainfall records? He asked. Claire nodded. Same as Walter used to. Dale removed his hat and wiped sweat from his forehead. Feels wrong this early. Claire looked toward the cloudless horizon. Ground's drying from underneath. Dale stared across her field. You really think those old seeds matter? Claire answered carefully. I think they remember hard years. Dale gave a low, thoughtful grunt. Then he surprised her. My granddad used to say modern farming made everybody too comfortable with easy weather. Claire smiled softly. Your granddad wasn't stupid. No, Dale said quietly. He definitely wasn't. That same week, Grant Holloway hosted a customer field demonstration outside town. Seed signs lined the road, company tents flapped in the wind, sales reps in pressed shirts spoke confidently about yield potential while handing out branded caps and cold drinks. Grant loved events like that. Control. Presentation. Numbers. At one point, while standing beside a thick green hybrid plot, Grant casually addressed the drought concerns spreading through the county. These genetics were built for stress, he announced. People panic too early every season. Someone mentioned Claire Adams. That drew scattered laughter. Grant smiled. Well, if anybody wants to compare modern seed to 60-year-old mason jar science, they're welcome to. More laughter, but not as much as before. Because beneath the jokes, anxiety had started growing roots. That evening, windstorms rolled across western Kansas without bringing rain. Dust swept low across roads and fields under copper-colored skies. Claire stood outside her barn, watching it happen. And suddenly she remembered being 9 years old beside her father, Harold Whitaker, during another dry spring. He had taken a handful of dirt and squeezed it silently before saying, "Most folks misunderstand drought." Claire looked up at him. "What do you mean?" Harold opened his hand slowly. "Drought doesn't start when the rain stops." He let the dust blow away. "It starts when the ground loses hope of getting more." Standing there decades later beneath another dry Kansas sky, Claire finally understood exactly what he meant. The land itself had changed. She could feel it. 2 mornings later, Leah arrived early, carrying coffee again. "You need to see something," Claire said immediately. They walked the western field together while dawn spread pale blue light across the prairie. At first, Leah noticed nothing unusual. Then Claire pointed toward neighboring farms. "Look closely." Leah narrowed her eyes. Several nearby fields already showed faint curling on upper leaves. Tiny stress signals, easy to miss. But once you saw them, you couldn't unsee them. Leah swallowed hard. "That's early." Claire nodded. "Too early." "And yours?" Claire crouched beside one of her own plants. Shorter, less attractive, but still open, still conserving, still alive in a different way. Leah stared across the field quietly. "You really think this could get bad?" Claire looked toward the empty sky. Then she said something Leah would remember for the rest of her life. "Good seasons make farmers feel smart," Claire said softly. "Bad seasons reveal what the seed actually was." And somewhere across Harper County, beneath all those beautiful green fields, the first cracks of fear had already begun spreading through the soil. By mid-June, Harper County stopped talking about whether there might be a drought. Now people talked about how bad it might become. That's an entirely different kind of conversation. The wheat harvest came in lighter than expected. Pond edges shrank into cracked mud rings. Pastures lost their deep green color weeks too early. And every afternoon the wind arrived hot. Not warm. Hot. The kind of heat that feels personal somehow. Like the sky itself has turned against you. At Miller's Diner, conversation shortened. Men stared longer at weather forecasts playing silently on the television mounted near the pie counter. 10-day outlooks. Triple digits. No rain. Again. Grant Holloway still spoke confidently, but even confidence changes tone once fear enters a room. "These hybrids are built for stress," he repeated one morning to a table full of worried farmers. "Everybody needs to stay calm." Nolan Briggs nodded quickly. "Roots are deep enough now. We just need one decent storm." Grant agreed immediately. One good rain changes everything. Now let me pause here. Hope can be dangerous when it depends entirely on something you cannot control. Claire Adams understood that better than most people in Harper County. Because while everyone else waited for rain, Claire had planted for the possibility that rain might never come. Every dawn she walked the western field before temperatures climbed high enough to blur the horizon. The plants still looked unimpressive above ground. Shorter, darker, tighter, no lush explosive growth. But unlike neighboring fields, Claire's rows remained steady. Not thriving, enduring. There's a difference. Leah Turner visited nearly every evening now, partly because she was curious, partly because she sensed history unfolding quietly in front of her. One night they stood together near the fence line, watching distant dust drift across Nolan Briggs' property. Leah frowned. His fields looked perfect 3 weeks ago. Claire nodded slightly. They were spending everything. Leah looked confused, spending what Water Claire answered. Energy, growth. Claire bent and touched one of her own plants gently. These are saving strength. Sit with that for a moment. Because survival often looks unimpressive right up until the moment everything else begins collapsing. 2 days later, Harper County crossed 40 consecutive days without meaningful rainfall. The county extension office released a drought advisory. Farmers responded the way farmers usually do when frightened, by working harder. Irrigation rigs ran longer hours. Additional fertilizer applications went out across stressed fields. Chemical consultants made emergency recommendations. Everybody kept trying to force abundance from exhausted ground. Everybody except Claire. One afternoon, Martin Reeves drove onto her property unexpectedly. Martin was the county extension agent, mid-50s, careful speaker, former agronomy professor who'd returned home after his father became ill years earlier. Unlike Grant Holloway, Martin respected uncertainty. That's one of the reasons intelligent people often sound less certain than fools. Claire found him kneeling beside her western field with a soil probe already pushed into the ground. "Hope you don't mind," he said, standing slowly. Claire shrugged lightly. "Land's easier to understand when you touch it." Martin studied the field quietly. "You planted Bennett seed." "Not a question." Claire nodded. Martin looked genuinely surprised. "I thought those stories were exaggerated." "Most people did." He crouched again, breaking apart soil carefully between his fingers. Then his expression changed. "These roots are deeper than they should be." Claire said nothing. Martin moved several rows over and repeated the process. Same result. He looked toward neighboring fields visible beyond the road. "They're burning moisture too fast." Claire finally spoke. "Bennett selected under drought conditions for 30 years. Martin stood very still after hearing that. "You're serious?" Claire nodded once. Martin looked across the field again with entirely new eyes. "Now, let me tell you something important. Real expertise recognizes itself quietly." That moment frightened Martin Reeves more than it excited him. Because if Claire Adams was right, then Harper County was standing at the edge of something very bad. That evening, Martin drove through several neighboring farms before heading home. Everywhere he stopped, he saw the same signs beginning to emerge. Leaf rolling, early stress response, shallow moisture exhaustion. The crops still looked decent from the highway. But up close, the land was starting to panic, and plants panic before people do. At Holloway Ag Supply, Grant continued reassuring customers publicly while privately increasing emergency product orders. That's how fear works in business. You deny it first. Then you quietly prepare for it. One customer asked whether older drought-resistant seed lines might perform better under extreme heat. Grant laughed immediately. Modern genetics outperform old lines in every measurable category. The customer nodded uncertainly. But doubt had entered the room now. And doubt spreads faster than confidence once crops begin struggling. Meanwhile, Claire's field remained strangely stable. Not beautiful. Stable. That distinction mattered enormously. Late one evening, Leah helped Claire inspect rows beneath fading orange light. "You know what scares me," Leah admitted softly. Claire kept walking. What Leah looked toward the surrounding farms. "Everybody still thinks your field looks weak." Claire smiled faintly. "Good." Leah blinked. "Good?" Claire stopped beside a row and looked out across the prairie. People noticed surviving fields too late. The wind shifted warm against them. Then Claire said something that stayed with Leah forever. "Nature hides strength differently than people do." Farther east across the county, Nolan Briggs finally began showing visible concern. His corn curled aggressively by noon every day now. Irrigation helped temporarily, but temperatures kept climbing faster than water reserves could compensate. One morning, he drove into town furious after hearing fuel prices had jumped again. At Miller's Diner, he slammed his coffee cup down harder than intended. "This heat's unreal." Grant leaned back calmly. "We still have time." Nolan shook his head. "No, we don't." Silence spread across the table. Finally, another farmer spoke quietly. "You seen Claire Adams' field lately?" The question hung there awkwardly. Grant forced a laugh. "You mean the dwarf sorghum patch?" Nobody joined in immediately. That bothered him. Nolan stared into his coffee. "It's still green," Grant answered too quickly. Stress genetics sometimes stay green longer before collapsing. But even he sounded less convinced now. Sheriff Dale Mercer happened to walk into the diner at that exact moment. He removed his hat slowly and glanced around the room. Funny thing about collapse, Dale said casually. The table looked up. The people predicting it are usually hoping they won't be around when they're proven wrong. Nobody answered, because deep down, every man at that table had started wondering the same terrifying thing. What if Claire Adams actually knew something they didn't? 3 nights later, the heat wave intensified again. 107 degrees. No clouds, no wind relief, just brutal stillness pressing down over Harper County like a weight. Claire woke before dawn, unable to sleep. She stepped outside carrying Walter's old notebook and walked slowly toward the western field. The air already felt warm, wrong warm. She knelt beside one of the Bennett plants and pressed her fingers into the soil. Still moisture below, barely, but enough. Claire closed her eyes briefly, and for the first time since planting, she allowed herself to feel afraid. Not for herself, for the county, because she had finally realized something terrible. The Bennett seed wasn't merely surviving drought, it had been prepared for one, and Harper County had not. The heat wave arrived in the first week of July like a punishment nobody could escape. 111 degrees, then 112. By the fourth straight day above triple digits, even the wind felt dangerous. Harper County stopped smelling like growing crops. Now it smelled like dry dirt, hot metal, and fear. Corn leaves rolled so tightly by noon they looked like green knives pointed toward the sky. Sorghum fields began turning dull gray-green beneath the stress. Irrigation pivots ran almost constantly across larger operations, but more water only delayed the damage now. It did not stop it, and perhaps the worst part, everybody could see it happening. Now let me tell you something about farmers. There is a special kind of helplessness in watching land die slowly in front of you while knowing there is almost nothing left to do. At Holloway, ag supply trucks lined the parking lot before sunrise every morning. Farmers wanted answers. Grant Holloway no longer smiled much. He stood behind the parts counter speaking in tighter sentences now. Keep watering. Reduce stress where you can. Don't panic yet. But panic had already arrived. One man accused Grant's premium hybrid package of collapsing faster than advertised. Another demanded refunds for failed drought tolerance claims. Grant defended the products aggressively at first, then defensively, then quietly. Because the fields themselves had started speaking louder than sales brochures. Meanwhile, 7 miles west of town, Claire Adams walked her western field beneath the same brutal sun and saw something entirely different. Not abundance, survival. The Bennett plants remained shorter than neighboring crops, but while surrounding fields curled inward from heat stress, Claire's rows still stood open in the morning hours, still conserving moisture, still functioning, and most importantly, still forming seed heads. Leah Turner noticed it first. "Oh my God," she whispered one dawn while inspecting the rows beside Claire. Tiny grain heads had begun emerging. Healthy, dense, alive. Leah stared across the fence line toward neighboring fields where pollination stress had already damaged large sections of crop. How is this possible? Claire knelt slowly beside one of the plants. The roots got there first. Leah looked confused. Claire pointed downward. Most modern crops are built to maximize good seasons. Bennett built these for bad ones. Sit with that for a moment. Because human beings often confuse optimization with resilience. But the two are not always the same thing. That afternoon, Martin Reeves returned with measuring tools and soil probes in the back of his extension truck. This time he stayed nearly 4 hours. He measured root depth, canopy temperature, soil moisture retention, leaf response. At one point, he stood silently beside Claire's field while hot wind pushed dust across the road. Finally, he spoke. "This shouldn't be happening." Claire removed her gloves carefully. "But it is." Martin nodded slowly. Then he said something that genuinely surprised her. "I think Bennett accidentally preserved a drought survival line." Claire looked toward the horizon. "No," she said quietly. "I think he did it on purpose." Martin stared across the field again. And suddenly, Elias Bennett no longer looked like an eccentric old dryland farmer who died forgotten on poor land. Now he looked like a man who had seen the future earlier than everyone else. By the second week of July, crop damage across Harper County became impossible to hide. Fields that looked perfect in May now showed massive stress, seed fill failure, pollination collapse, heat abortion. The language of disaster spread quickly once experts finally admitted reality. At Miller's Diner, nobody joked much anymore. Coffee cups sat untouched while farmers studied rainfall maps and commodity projections. Nolan Briggs looked 10 years older than he had a month earlier. "We're losing yield by the hour," he muttered one morning. Another farmer shook his head slowly. "I've never seen it hit this fast." Then somebody near the counter quietly said, "Claire Adams' field is still green." Silence. Nobody laughed this time. Grant Holloway stared down into his coffee. Finally, he forced a thin smile. Stress crops sometimes stay green right before failure, but even he no longer sounded convinced by his own words. Sheriff Dale Mercer glanced toward Grant calmly. "Funny thing," Dale said. "People keep waiting for Claire's field to die." Grant didn't answer, because deep down, he had started waiting too. That evening, pickup trucks began slowing regularly along the road beside Claire's property. At first, people only looked from a distance. Then some stopped completely. Farmers climbed out quietly and stared across the western field without speaking much. One afternoon, Nolan Briggs himself walked through the gate awkwardly. Claire was repairing an irrigation pipe near the barn when he approached. "You busy?" he asked. Claire straightened slowly. "Depends what for." Nolan shoved his hands into his pockets. "I wanted to see the field up close." Claire studied him for a second, then nodded once. "Come on." They walked the rows together beneath blazing sunlight. Nolan stopped repeatedly to inspect the plants. Healthy heads. Deep green lower leaves, moisture retention far beyond neighboring crops. Finally, he looked genuinely shaken. "My hybrids cost me almost $300 an acre," he said quietly. Claire said nothing. Nolan crouched and grabbed a plant near its base. The roots resisted hard even in dry soil. "How did you know?" he asked finally. Claire looked out across the field before answering. "I didn't." Nolan frowned. Claire touched one of the seed heads gently. The seed knew. Now let me pause here. That sentence spread across Harper County faster than any rumor all year, because people repeat simple truths once reality forces them to. Within days, more trucks appeared outside Claire's fence line. Some farmers came curious, some embarrassed, some desperate, and all of them stared at those fields differently now. Not as relics, not as nostalgia, as possibility. One evening, Grant Holloway drove out himself. He parked near the gate and remained inside his truck several moments before climbing out. That alone told Claire plenty. Confident men walk fast, worried men hesitate. Grant approached the field carefully. "You mind if I take a look?" he asked. Claire nodded once. They walked several rows in silence. Grant inspected the heads, the leaf condition, the moisture retention. His expression tightened more with every step. "These yields won't beat top hybrids in a wet year," he finally said. Claire nodded calmly. "No." Grant looked at her sharply. "But they survive." Claire met his eyes. "Yes." For several long seconds, neither spoke. Hot wind moved through the field around them. Then Grant asked the question he'd spent weeks avoiding. "How much seed do you still have left?" There it was. The moment everything changed. Not publicly yet, but morally, emotionally. The balance of power had shifted. The same man who laughed at dusty mason jars in March was now standing inside the surviving field asking how much remained. Claire answered honestly, "Not much." Grant's jaw tightened slightly. "You planning to multiply it next year?" Claire looked toward the farmhouse. "Maybe." Grant hesitated. Then carefully, "There could be serious demand for this kind of line." Claire almost smiled. Funny how quickly worthless things become valuable. Grant looked away first. Sit with that for a moment. Because quiet revenge rarely arrives with shouting. Sometimes it arrives through silence, powerful enough to force other people into humility. That night, after Grant left, Claire sat alone on her porch beneath a dark Kansas sky. The heat still lingered even after sunset. Far away, she could see irrigation systems glowing beneath distant fields, fighting losing battles against the drought. Claire held Walter's notebook in her lap. She turned slowly to one of his older entries from years ago. "Hard seasons reveal who prepared for survival instead of applause." Claire read the sentence twice. Then she looked out toward the western field where forgotten seed from dusty jars had just begun changing the entire county. And for the first time all summer, Claire Adams realized Harper County was coming to her fence not to laugh anymore. They were coming because they were afraid. By late July, Harper County no longer viewed Claire Adams as an old widow clinging to outdated farming methods. Now they viewed her as the woman standing between them and another ruined season. And let me tell you something uncomfortable about human nature. Respect that arrives after desperation rarely feels noble. It feels frightened. Every morning, trucks appeared outside Claire's property before sunrise. Some drivers stayed inside pretending they were just passing through. Others walked directly to the fence line carrying questions they would have mocked 3 months earlier. How much seed do you have left? Can it be multiplied quickly? Would it survive another year like this? Could she sell enough for next spring? The questions changed daily. The tone never did. Urgency. One morning, Claire opened her front door and found Nolan Briggs standing on the porch holding his hat in both hands. Now that alone would have shocked half the county. Men like Nolan rarely approached anyone humbly, especially not Claire Adams. I wanted to apologize, he said awkwardly. Claire studied him quietly. Nolan glanced toward the western field. I laughed at you. Claire nodded once. You weren't alone. Nolan swallowed hard. I lost almost 40% already. There it was, the truth beneath all the pride. Not just fear, loss, real loss, equipment payments, operating loans, land notes. Farmers don't merely grow crops. They borrow against hope every single season, and drought collects payment brutally. Nolan looked toward the barn before speaking again. How much seed do you still have? Claire motioned toward 2 old chairs near the porch. Sit down. Now let me pause here. The most powerful people in difficult times are often the ones who remain calm while everybody else rushes. Claire had no intention of becoming rich from Harper County's panic. That mattered enormously, because desperation attracts predators just as quickly as it attracts survivors. By the following week, the western field had become almost legendary across neighboring counties. People drove miles simply to see it. Not because it was beautiful. It wasn't. The plants remained shorter than commercial hybrids. Yields would never break records. But while surrounding crops looked exhausted and defeated beneath the endless heat, Claire's field still stood alive, still filling grain, still holding. And suddenly, everybody understood the same terrifying truth at once. The future belonged to crops that survived bad years, not crops that looked impressive during easy ones. At Holloway Ag Supply, business had turned tense. Grant Holloway spent most days behind closed office doors arguing with distributors and fielding furious customer calls. One afternoon, a farmer openly accused him of overselling drought resistance. Another threatened legal action over catastrophic losses. Grant defended himself the only way he knew how, with numbers, charts, research trials, performance data. But data loses authority once real fields begin dying. Late that evening, Grant drove out to Claire's farm again. This time he arrived alone. No polished confidence, no casual jokes, just exhaustion. Claire found him standing beside the western fence line, watching the field in silence. You came back? She said calmly. Grant nodded slowly. I needed another look. The sun hung low behind them, turning the dust-filled sky copper orange. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Grant finally turned toward her. I'll be honest, he said. I underestimated you. Claire folded her arms lightly. No, she answered. You underestimated the seed. Grant accepted that without argument, and that told Claire more than words could. Because proud men only stop defending themselves once reality leaves them nowhere to hide. Grant looked back toward the field. How many acres could you plant next year? Claire didn't answer immediately. That worried him. Finally, she said, That depends on why. Grant frowned slightly. What do you mean? Claire looked directly at him now. If this becomes another product line, it dies. Grant blinked. You can't seriously expect people not to commercialize this. Claire's voice remained calm. Elias Bennett spent 30 years protecting survival genetics. Nobody cared about because there wasn't enough money in it. The wind moved softly through the field around them. Claire continued. The second people chase yield over resilience again, they'll destroy what made this line valuable. Grant stared at her quietly, and for the first time in years, he realized he might be speaking to someone wiser than himself. That realization unsettled him deeply. Sit with that for a moment. Because intelligence is not what humbles people. Reality is. 3 days later, Martin Reeves organized an emergency county agriculture meeting at the high school gymnasium. The turnout shocked everyone. Farmers filled nearly every folding chair. Men who normally argued politics now sat silently studying crop loss projections pinned to poster boards near the stage. Martin spoke carefully. No one should panic, he began. That sentence alone told the room panic had already arrived. He reviewed rainfall deficits, heat stress conditions, yield damage estimates. Then finally, someone asked the question everybody came there for. What about Claire Adams' seed? The gym went completely still. Martin adjusted his glasses slowly. The Bennett line shows extremely unusual drought resilience characteristics. Murmurs spread instantly. One farmer stood up. So what's the plan? Martin hesitated, and before he could answer, Claire herself stood quietly from the back row. People turned immediately. The room fell silent again. Claire walked slowly toward the front of the gym, carrying one of Elias Bennett's old mason jars in both hands. Dust still clung faintly to the glass. I'll tell you the plan, she said softly. Nobody interrupted. Claire looked around the room, some faces embarrassed, some hopeful, some desperate. I'm not selling ownership of this seed. A few farmers exchanged frustrated looks immediately. Claire continued before anyone could object. This county forgot something important. Her voice never rose. That made people listen harder. We stopped planting for survival. The gym stayed silent enough to hear the old ceiling fans turning overhead. Claire lifted the mason jar slightly. Elias Bennett protected these lines because hard years always come back eventually. She looked directly toward Grant Holloway sitting near the side wall. And hard years don't care how modern you think you are. Nobody laughed. Nobody even moved. Claire set the jar gently on the table beside Martin Reeves. Then she delivered the sentence Harper County would talk about for decades afterward. If you want this seed, she said, you agree to preserve it, share it, replant it, protect it. Confused murmurs spread through the room. Nolan Briggs frowned. You mean like a co-op? Claire nodded. No patents, no exclusive ownership, no corporation controls it. Grant spoke for the first time. That's not how modern seed systems work. Claire looked at him calmly. That's why modern systems nearly failed this county. Silence again. Heavy silence. The kind that arrives when people realize somebody just told the truth publicly. Sheriff Dale Mercer leaned back in his chair, slowly smiling beneath his mustache. Pastor Raymond Pike lowered his head slightly, like a man listening to a sermon he agreed with. And Leah Turner sat near the back of the gym, watching something remarkable happen in real time. The entire county was being forced into humility by the very woman they mocked for buying dusty jars at an auction. Not through revenge, not through cruelty, through wisdom. Now let me tell you the most important part. Claire Adams could have become wealthy that summer, very wealthy. Companies would have paid enormous money for exclusive access to those drought lines. Grant himself understood that better than anyone in the room. But Claire wasn't trying to become powerful. She was trying to make sure Harper County survived the next drought too. And deep down, that realization made people respect her far more than success ever could have. The field day happened on the second Saturday in August, and nobody in Harper County would ever forget it. By 7 in the morning, trucks already lined both sides of the gravel road leading to Claire Adams' farm. Dust rolled slowly across the prairie beneath another pale, exhausted sky, while farmers climbed out carrying notebooks, cameras, coffee thermoses, and expressions they would never have admitted to a month earlier. Hope. Not confidence. Hope. There's a difference. Claire stood near the barn, watching the crowd arrive in silence. Leah Turner helped place folding chairs beneath a temporary shade tent, while Sheriff Dale Mercer directed traffic with the calm patience of a man who understood this wasn't really about farming anymore. This had become something larger. Martin Reeves walked across the yard carrying stacks of printed field reports beneath one arm. You realize, he told Claire quietly, we've got people here from 3 counties. Claire looked toward the road. More trucks still arriving. That many, Martin gave a tired smile. Desperate people drive far. Now let me pause here. Nothing travels faster through rural America than news of somebody surviving what everybody else feared, especially when the survivor was publicly mocked first. By 9 o'clock, nearly 200 people stood gathered near Claire's western field, the same field they once laughed at from passing trucks. Only now, nobody laughed. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Beyond Claire's property, large sections of Harper County looked tired, brittle, defeated. Entire fields had failed pollination during the heat wave. Some farmers had already begun calculating insurance losses instead of harvest yields. And then there was Claire's field, still standing, not lush, not enormous, but alive. Healthy seed heads moved gently beneath hot Kansas wind while neighboring fields continued collapsing around them. Martin Reeves stepped forward first to address the crowd. "This isn't a miracle," he said carefully. That sentence mattered, because rural communities distrust magic, but they respect evidence. Martin held up several field reports. "We've tested root depth, moisture retention, pollination response, and stress adaptation across multiple plots." He glanced toward Claire briefly. "The Bennett line demonstrates unusually stable performance under prolonged drought stress." Murmurs moved through the crowd. Farmers leaned closer. Martin continued. "These plants sacrifice maximum yield potential during favorable seasons in exchange for survival resilience during severe environmental stress." Now let me translate what that meant in plain English. The Bennett seed was not designed to win beauty contests. It was designed to survive hard years. And suddenly, after months of drought, that sounded far more valuable. Nolan Briggs stood near the front beside several large acreage operators. Just weeks earlier, those same men had mocked Claire openly. Now they listened like students. One older farmer raised his hand. "You saying modern hybrids are useless?" Martin shook his head immediately. "No. I'm saying agriculture became overly dependent on optimization instead of resilience." Claire noticed Grant Holloway standing near the back of the crowd alone. No polished sales posture today. No smiling confidence, just quiet observation. Sit with that for a moment. Because humiliation changes shape once pride collapses. Sometimes the loudest apology is silence. After Martin finished, people followed Claire into the field itself, and that's when the emotional shift truly happened. Farmers bent down examining the heads carefully. Some dug roots with pocket knives. Others touched leaves silently, like men trying to understand something sacred. Leah overheard one whisper, "Lord, it's actually filling grain." Another farmer shook his head slowly. "I thought she'd lost her mind." "No," somebody answered quietly nearby. "Turns out she remembered something we forgot." Claire walked among them calmly. No gloating, no speeches, no revenge performance. That unsettled people more deeply than anger would have, because dignity has a way of exposing shame naturally. At one point, a younger farmer approached her hesitantly. "Mrs. Adams," he said awkwardly, "I made jokes at the diner back in spring." Claire nodded lightly. The young man swallowed hard. "I shouldn't have." Claire looked out across the field. Most people only respect preparation after disaster arrives. The young farmer lowered his eyes slightly. Then Claire surprised him. "What matters now," she said gently, "is whether you learn from it." And there it was. The reason Harper County slowly stopped seeing Claire Adams as merely a stubborn old widow. Wisdom without cruelty. That combination changes people. Around noon, Martin invited Claire to speak to the crowd formally beneath the shade tent. She clearly didn't want to. Leah could tell immediately. Claire preferred conversations, not stages, but eventually she stepped forward holding Elias Bennett's old rainfall notebook in both hands. The crowd quieted instantly. Wind moved softly through the tent edges while distant irrigation systems hummed somewhere across the valley. Claire opened the notebook carefully. "The first entry in here is from 1981, she said. Her voice remained calm and steady. Elias Bennett recorded rainfall, root depth, and drought survival observations for nearly 30 years. People listened harder now than they had listened to anyone all summer. Claire turned another page. He wasn't selecting for yield. Another page. He was selecting for survival. Then she looked up from the notebook, and everybody laughed at him too. Silence. Heavy silence. Claire held the old notebook slightly higher. This county forgot something important. Nobody moved. We started believing agriculture was about conquering nature. The wind shifted warm across the crowd. Claire's voice softened. But farming was never supposed to be conquest. She looked toward the western field. It was supposed to be partnership. Now let me tell you something truthful. People remember facts for a while, but they remember humility for decades. That speech changed Harper County more than the drought itself, because for the first time farmers began admitting something privately they had avoided for years. Modern systems had made them arrogant, too dependent on perfect conditions, too dismissive of older knowledge, too confident that technology alone guaranteed security. Claire closed the notebook slowly. My father used to say hard years expose what people worship. The crowd stayed completely silent now. Claire continued, if all you worship is production, then drought becomes judgment. Some men lowered their heads slightly after hearing that, not because Claire intended to shame them, because truth was finally landing. At the edge of the crowd, Grant Holloway stood motionless, and perhaps nobody felt the weight of Claire's words more heavily than he did. After the presentation ended, people lingered for hours, not gossiping, learning. Farmers brought old seed jars from truck beds, asking Claire whether they still mattered. One man admitted his grandfather kept dryland corn lines nobody planted anymore. Another described wheat seed preserved in a basement freezer since the 1990s. For the first time in years, Harper County stopped talking about farming only in terms of chemicals, financing, and yield projections. Now they talked about stewardship, legacy, adaptation, memory. Late in the afternoon, Grant finally approached Claire near the barn. The crowd had thinned enough for privacy now. Grant looked exhausted beneath the heat. "I owe you something," he said quietly. Claire waited. Grant looked down briefly before speaking again. "I built my business around the idea that newer automatically meant better." Claire leaned lightly against the fence rail. "That's a common mistake." Grant nodded slowly. "I mocked you because I thought you were afraid of progress." Claire studied him calmly, and now Grant looked out toward the surviving field. "Now I think you were protecting something." For several moments, neither spoke. Then Grant said the sentence nobody in Harper County ever expected to hear from him. "I'd like to help." Claire frowned slightly, with what Grant looked across the remaining crowd. "Teaching people how not to lose this again. Sit with that for a moment, because redemption begins the moment pride becomes useful instead of performative." As evening settled across Harper County, the last truck slowly disappeared down the gravel road. Claire remained standing near the western field long after everyone left. The surviving seed heads moved softly beneath fading sunlight. Leah walked beside her quietly. "You realize this changed the county," Leah said. Claire looked toward the horizon where dead fields stretched beneath orange skies. "No," she answered softly. Then she touched one of the grain heads gently. "The drought changed the county." A long silence passed between them. Finally, Leah asked, "What did you change?" Claire watched the wind move through Bennett's surviving line, and with the calm voice of someone who understood land better than most people understand themselves, she answered, "I just listened before it was too late." The first real rain came in late September. Not a storm, not a miracle, just a long, steady rainfall moving slowly across western Kansas like the land had finally decided to breathe again. Claire Adams stood beneath the porch roof listening to water strike dry ground, while the scent of wet dirt rose across the farm for the first time in months. And if you've never smelled rain after drought, then you've never truly understood relief. Water dripped from the barn roof in silver lines while puddles formed beside tire ruts that had sat empty all summer long. Behind the farmhouse, the western field stood nearly harvested now. Not record-breaking, not wealthy-making, but alive. Alive when so many others had failed. That mattered more. Now let me tell you what happened after the drought, because survival changes communities in ways comfort never can. By October, Harper County looked different, quieter, humbler. Farmers who once argued about maximizing yield now asked questions about soil retention, seed adaptation, and dryland resilience. Old notebooks reappeared from closets. Grandfathers suddenly became interesting again. Men who once laughed at backward farming began searching basements and barns for forgotten local seed lines. The drought had not merely damaged crops, it had damaged arrogance, and that may have saved the county more than rain itself. 3 weeks after the field day, Martin Reeves visited Claire carrying rolled-up building sketches beneath one arm. They sat together at her kitchen table while afternoon sunlight fell across Walter's old notebooks. "What's this?" Claire asked. Martin spread the papers open carefully. "A seed house." Claire looked up slowly. Martin smiled faintly. "You started something bigger than a field." The sketches showed a modest building beside the extension office downtown. Climate storage, seed archive shelves, community propagation rooms, a shared preservation cooperative? Claire stared at the plans quietly. "You're serious?" Martin nodded. "Very." Leah Turner entered halfway through the conversation carrying coffee and immediately stopped short when she saw the drawings. No way, she whispered. Martin pointed toward one section proudly. "Educational wing here. Another section. Community storage here. Then finally, we want to call it the Bennett Adams Seed House." Claire sat very still after hearing that. "Sit with that for a moment. because some forms of respect arrive so quietly they almost hurt. Claire looked down at the plans again. Not for herself. For Elias Bennett. A forgotten dryland farmer whose life nearly disappeared into an estate auction until the drought revealed what he had protected for 30 years. He should be remembered, Claire said softly. Martin nodded once. That's the idea. Construction began the following spring. Nothing fancy, just solid, wood frame walls, practical storage systems, temperature-controlled rooms built more for purpose than appearance. And slowly, something remarkable started happening. People donated seed, not corporations. Families, old wheat lines, dryland corn, heat-resistant beans, sorghum varieties passed through generations. Each jar arrived carrying stories alongside genetics. This one survived the '88 drought. My grandmother planted these during the fuel crisis. My father kept these hidden in the freezer for 20 years. Leah Turner helped catalog every entry by hand. Family names, rainfall history, field notes, survival traits. She once told Claire this place feels more like a memory bank than a seed bank. Claire smiled faintly. That's because it is. Now let me pause here. Civilizations survive because somebody preserves knowledge during easy years that later generations desperately need during hard ones. Most people never notice those protectors while they're working. Grant Holloway began visiting the seed house regularly during construction. At first, many people distrusted his presence, some openly. Nolan Briggs once muttered, "Funny how fast a salesman becomes a historian." But Claire never joined the bitterness. Because unlike most people in Harper County, she understood pride itself had nearly destroyed Grant long before the drought ever arrived. One afternoon, Grant approached Claire while they sorted storage shelves inside the unfinished building. "You know," he said carefully, "I spent 20 years believing agriculture's job was to outsmart nature." Claire continued labeling jars without looking up, and now Grant stared toward the fields beyond town. "Now I think survival starts when you respect limits." Claire nodded once. That was enough. Redemption rarely needs speeches, only honesty followed by work. By the second year, the Bennett Adams Seed House had become known across 3 counties. Agriculture students visited on school trips. Extension agents referenced the preservation program in conferences. Farmers exchanged adapted seed lines instead of guarding them like private weapons. And perhaps most importantly, people began talking differently. Less certainty, more listening, more humility toward land itself. Sheriff Dale Mercer liked to sit on the bench outside the seed house during summer evenings watching families come and go. One afternoon, Leah asked him, "You ever think a few dusty jars would change this county?" Dale chuckled softly. "Nope." Then his expression turned thoughtful. "But I've lived long enough to know the things people laugh at first usually deserve a second look." Inside the seed house, Claire carefully arranged Elias Bennett's original mason jars inside a glass display case. She placed Walter's rainfall notebooks beside them, not as museum pieces, as warnings. Above the display, Leah hung a small wooden sign carved by a local carpenter. "Prepare for hard years before they arrive." Simple. True. One October evening, nearly 3 years after the drought, Claire remained alone inside the seed house after sunset. Golden light filtered through the windows, while shelves full of preserved seed stretched quietly around her. Thousands of jars now. Thousands. Each one representing survival someone once nearly discarded. Claire moved slowly through the aisles, running her fingers lightly across handwritten labels. Bennett Line C, Dry Creek White Milo, Red Plains 43. She stopped near the display case holding Elias Bennett's original notebook. Outside, children's voices drifted faintly from the town baseball field down the road. Normal life. Recovered life. The kind people assume simply continues automatically until disaster reminds them otherwise. Claire opened the notebook carefully to the first page. Dry spring again. Keep selecting survivors. She smiled softly. Then she whispered something nobody else heard. "You were right, Elias." For several long moments, she simply stood there listening to the quiet hum of the cooling system and distant Kansas wind outside the building. And suddenly Walter felt close again. Not in a ghostly way. In the way grief sometimes softens when purpose finally grows around it. Now let me tell you the final truth of this story. People in Harper County once believed Claire Adams was preserving the past because she was afraid of the future. They were wrong. Claire understood the future better than all of them, because the future belongs to communities that remember what hardship teaches before hardship returns again. As darkness settled outside, Claire turned off the final light inside the seed house. Only the glass display remained softly illuminated in the corner. Dusty mason jars, forgotten seed, the very thing an entire county once laughed at. And standing there in the quiet glow of that small Kansas building, those jars no longer looked old, they looked eternal.